Yo guys, welcome back to another Five Nights Tower Defense video, and today we are back with another tier list. 2 weeks ago I made a tier list and they've added a couple of new characters since then, mainly coin characters and these 3 new glitch characters, and I felt that just those 5 characters are enough to update the tier list, especially when some of these characters did get some nerfs and buffs, mostly buffs. And yeah, I do plan to make another tier list once the FNAF 4 update comes out, because that's going to include a bunch of new characters that we will have to rank, and I feel like there will probably be more balance changes once that happens. But yeah, let's get right into it. So first of all, I want to say that there will be 3 different tier lists that I'm going to do. This is the main one where I directly rank everyone by direct placements, comparing everyone to each other. But there is 2 different category type of tier lists that I have that I will be showing later in the video. There will be timestamps for that, so I recommend you guys go check those out, because I feel like those tier lists are more fair in comparing characters, but I know you guys would probably like to see direct comparisons as well, so I will still be doing this tier list, and I will be ranking these ones live in the recording. So before we begin this, I do want to explain all of the tiers. So bottom 3 is just bottom 3, and they are so bad that you probably would never want to use them. D tier is just very bad characters that basically end up being useless after FNAF 1. C tier is they're good enough and beginners can have a good time using them when they're starting off, but after that they end up being really bad. B tier is mid characters but still usable, meaning that their overall power is not very comparable to these rest of the characters, but they are actually usable and can be run. They're either just power crept or not the best version of that character that can be run. A tier is just for good characters. They're viable in any sort of game. S tier is very good characters that you will have success in using anywhere. S plus is just top-notch characters. This is where the best of the best will be, and I think you will never really have a problem running them at all. And of course, the top 3. We will be doing the same top 3 as my previous video, where I will include someone who has an AoE/splash ability, a starter, and a single target DPS. Alright, let's get started. So first of all, we have the uncommon Freddy. He's gonna go in C tier. Not very good, but he's not very bad. He's surprisingly good for what he is, and is very cheap, so you can use him for quite a while, but he of course does taper off really badly after FNAF 1. Next up is the Chica, obviously D tier. Even though Chica has the splash ability, she has like bottom 3 DPS, I'm pretty sure, and just costs more than Freddy and whatnot. Overall, not very good. Next we have Toy Freddy, also really bad DPS and not the cheapest of characters, so not very good. Next we have Foxy, just slightly better I feel like than Toy Freddy because of the DPS and less cost, but really bad range, so really hard to use him. Next is Wither Chica, also really bad. Everyone here is just really bad and very hard to use, and these 3 can honestly be like swapped around, mostly these 2 since their DPS is close, but overall they're just really bad. Next is this Toy Bonnie, who is also D tier, just too expensive for its DPS. It's not very good, but not the worst of the worst we will see here. Next we have the Withered Foxy, who is just a better version of Toy Bonnie, does insanely more DPS for the price, and is more viable. Still not very good of a character though. Next up is Phantom Balloon Boy, really bad for its cost. Even though it has the splash damage, they do only end up doing at most like 260 DPS, which is barely any better than all of the characters here, while costing like 5 times the price or more, so not very good. This is organized a little bit weird, but I guess we'll move on to Withered Golden Freddy, who is our first S tier. As time goes on, I do feel like he's gonna keep going lower and lower, but still a very good character, has yet to be completely power crept, but I can see them dropping a few tiers or just a tier within the FNAF 4 update. Not too much has changed since the last tier list, so I think it's fair for them to be on the upper echelons of good characters. Next is Rock and Bonnie, obviously very bad, but these guys are so bad, I'd rather have the AoE ability for the actual stages you guys would likely use them for, which would be like early stages of FNAF 1, where he would get a lot more value with his AoE than these single targets, and would do better splash than Chica. Overall, all of these guys are very bad though. Next up is Withered Bonnie, a character who has been power crept a lot, so I do believe they are just mid. The big reason why they are so power crept is because you have to spend a fortune to max them out and have their really good DPS. And of course, there is characters who just have better DPS than him for less cost, including Phantom Mangle and other characters that have released since then, who just end up being cheaper and either having almost as good DPS or straight up better DPS. So they end up being one of the worst options and just is mid but usable because he does actually have that good amount of DPS. It's just he's one of the worst options because of the cost. Next up is Plain Boy, and he is one of the examples I was talking about where he does cost less but does a little less damage, but it is worth it and makes him a little better than Withered Bonnie, but there will be better examples later on. Next is Endo, and they will be our first S+, and while I'm doing this, I will be including Spring Bonnie. So first of all, this is only including if they are shiny, and I am talking about base level of everyone except for these boosters. So if they didn't have shiny, they would just be like D tier. Like, it's not really worth the extra damage boost to have them on your team. But when they are shiny, they're practically a guaranteed placement in your team for that damage boost. You're basically like doubling your DPS for your really good characters, so they are always going to be viable, and of course are must-have characters. So the only way that they would be replaced if there ends up being a better damage booster, or if they somehow get nerfed or aren't viable in some way. But for now, their utility is so strong and is probably forever going to be S+ tier, but of course aren't necessarily the best towers in the game, so they'll just stay there at the bottom of S+. Next up is Endless Puppet, and surprise surprise, they are the worst. If you guys don't know why, it's because they're literally doing like the same amount of DPS as these characters shown here, while being like 100 times more expensive. And there's of course characters who would do what the puppet does, but infinitely better. But yeah, overall, really not worth using. Next up is Pirate Withered Foxy, just a really power crept starter. They were insanely good on release, but now they are mid, going right there in B tier. It's just that other DPS starters have released since then, and his DPS is not enough compared to them. Moving on, we have Baker Chica, and they're probably gonna go like above Uncommon Freddy. Their DPS is actually similar to Patriot Freddy, but they cost nearly 3 times as much. So they have the AoE ability and does damage, so I think they are viable enough, but their DPS is too little, and unlike Patriot, they actually do cost a good amount to use, so not very viable at all. Should rather spend your money on other characters who do more DPS and whatnot. Next up is Blighted Endo Freddy, who will be mid as well, but probably here. And like the other towers, his damage is just not enough anymore, but of course is still usable. A lot of these B tier towers just end up not doing enough damage, or is power crept in like the cost to in order to place them, or their range is too little now. And as time goes on, there will be harder events where these guys would practically be useless, but of course they can be used in either those stages or older stages where they actually will prove to be good. It's just that compared to other towers, they are not good. Next up will be the Puppeteer, who I believe is S tier. Has yet to be really power crept. They do exactly the same DPS as Endo Freddy, however, the big catch is that they cost way less. I think Endo Freddy does end up having more range. So the only thing is Endo does end up having a little more range, but only by 4. And while costing literally twice as much, it is not worth that extra range. So Puppeteer, their main value is of course the AoE while doing solid DPS, and basically just helps out in story mode a lot. There is of course better towers now that do basically the same role, and of course their damage as times goes on is not the very best, but they're still going to be viable in this meta. They could end up being a tier lower, but as of right now, they are S tier, and they also have a good chance of falling a tier below in the next season, just like Golden Wither Freddy. Next we have Summer Toy Bunny, obviously really bad and does less DPS. I think they actually have the worst or second worst DPS. But just like Rock and Bonnie, I feel like I would rather use them than these characters. It really doesn't matter. They're all very close in being bad, but these two I feel like have a bit more utility. I will say that there is 3 slow characters, and out of all 3 of them, he is the best for when you need slows at the start of the game, but in later portions of the game, they are not very good for slows because they do like no damage, which is basically what Abyssal Foxy is for. We will get to him later. And the only contender for like early game slows would be Amalgam, and I might as well place them in their ranking, because if Summer Toy Bonnie is a better slow for the start of the game while being D tier, then obviously Amalgam is worse. And yeah, they do no damage and cost more to place than Summer Toy Bonnie, so they really have practically no value. Moving on, we will go to Hawaii Endo, and same thing, where this is only really counting them with Shiny. Without Shiny, their boost is fairly noticeable and won't actually change your characters that much. But with Shiny, it is a nice support and boost in their power, especially for AoE characters like Puppeteer. But obviously the boost is not nearly as good as damage boosters, and it's hard to use both of them in a team. So since damage boosters have a lot more value, then they will be a mid but usable booster. Of course, without Shiny, they would be D tier. Next is Coco Boy, who is literally just a better version of Mythic Balloon Boy, but they do only end up being bottom of C tier because of this, because he's still not very good. Moving on, we have 7 Seas Foxy, who is actually now S tier. In the last tier list, I don't know how low I placed him, but I know for sure he wasn't like S tier or anything, because he was actually pretty bad. But the buff that they recently gave him, he now has 4 placements instead of 3, and now does, I believe, like 200 more damage per second. So that leads to 450 damage per second per 7 Seas Foxy that you place, which leads to 1,800 DPS, which is comparable to this guy right here. but I do believe he ends up being a little worse, at least for now. Because in totality, I believe he does end up costing more, but he does have a lot more range. But another thing is his AoE mechanic is just piercing, so it's not as valuable, but I can see them like being swapped around. They're pretty close in power. It's just that, would you prefer the piercing and big range or the cheaper cost and better AoE mechanic? Next up, we have Leviathan, who used to be the best character in the game, in my opinion, but recently has fallen off a little bit because the next 5 new characters, some of them might end up being better. So yeah, they are no longer top 3 in my opinion. Still obviously extremely good. Their main weaknesses is just their range, and of course not having the best AoE ability, but just having a AoE ability makes your character way stronger than most characters. But in the case of like Endo Freddy, it doesn't matter when you cost a lot and don't do the best damage. But of course with like Puppeteer, they cost like an affordable amount where it is valid to use them. Next up we have Rad Freddy, and they have just always been underrated in my opinion. But yeah, they're gonna be our first A tier because they're a great unit, but they're not the best of the best. They're just a good starter that you can use. Next up is Phantom Puppet, who is just above this Puppeteer. So it's a little interesting with this. I might as well also include the next character who I do want to include in this topic, which is Bounded Shadow, who recently got buffed, and it was a pretty big buff because I would just guaranteed put them below Phantom Puppet, but now I believe they can be better than Phantom Puppet. And all 3 of these guys are interchangeable but have similar uses and end up being very good because of their abilities. So what they do is, I guess we can also include 7 Cs. They do solid DPS while having a splash mechanic, and that just makes them better than most of the game because they're doing usually more DPS than the rest of the game while also doing a splash mechanic that also makes them a lot better than the rest of the game because you are almost always facing more than one enemy. It is very rare for you not to. Only really like the bosses at the end of story modes, which aren't always the hardest to kill, and you will likely have a tower who is gonna carry your DPS anyways. So these guys are really good for carrying the actual game itself, where you are fighting swarms of enemies. So the pros and cons for all 4 of them are, these 2 do the least amount of damage compared to everyone here, but they are some of the cheaper options to use. You have the most total range and also have one of the better mechanics. You as well have one of the better mechanics because both of them have a piercing mechanic where the projectile kind of like forever pierces, like it doesn't ever have an end to them, and it has a pretty big radius of piercing too. So every projectile that they throw, it's very likely to actually pierce more than one, even if you don't line it up correctly to lanes, which is one of the cons of the piercing mechanic, but also can be a very big benefit when they are piercing a very long line of enemies. But AoE overall ends up being more consistent. So the Phantom Puppet doesn't do that much more DPS than these 2, only like 400. But then this Bounded Shadow, who has the worst piercing mechanic out of all 4 of them, does have the most damage out of all of them, and does 200 more damage than Phantom Puppet, and also means that they do 600 more damage compared to Puppeteer and 7Cs. And they aren't the most expensive one out of the bunch. In terms of cost, I believe that from most expensive to least expensive would be Phantom Puppet, then 7Cs, then Bound in Shadow, and then Puppeteer. So overall, it's kind of hard to rank these four, but they're obviously very good, and they all kind of dominate the S tier, but aren't quite S plus tier. Anyways, that was a long one. Time to move on. Next, we have the Fazcade, who is just a okay support. I think I would just put them in like, B tier, because they are mid but usable. And honestly, only usable in co-op games, because co-op games is where you can struggle for money. But like in the same situation, like it's likely that other towers would end up being a better option. So it's really hard to rank this Fazcade, especially when I don't do duos, trios, or quads that much. But they are only really usable for that. In solo runs, they are practically useless, so they can honestly just be at D tier or bottom 3. But I'll just keep them there for now, since they can have a use. I don't really care for the placement of it. Anyways, moving on, we have Endo03, who will be the top of C tier. They're just a little too expensive, but they have one of the more impressive DPS compared to all of these towers. They could also end up being like bottom of B, but I don't really care. I'll just leave them there. I feel like the next characters above them are notably better, and you guys will see who in a second. But first, we're gonna check out Sniper Cupcake, who is also C tier, probably here. They're just a worse version of Rad, so obviously is a few tiers below. But their DPS is not that bad, especially with the good range that they have. But still, their DPS is not the best, so they will stay in C tier. Next up is Phantom Mangle, someone who has also been very power crept, and at this point I believe they are just in A tier, above Rad. So they do end up doing more DPS than most of the cast, but there is now characters who do more damage and also cost less to do that amount of damage. And same with like Withered Bonnie, there's also some characters who cost less and do almost as much damage, and one of those characters being Withered Golden Freddy. So they end up being notably a better character because of that. So yeah, kind of just power crept, ended up not being very good, because the main reason why they were very good back then, because he was the one who did the most damage in the game. Since there's now like 4 characters who do more damage than him now, and of course there is still characters who do less damage but cost less to do that much damage, and characters who have better overall abilities than him. He's just gonna be A tier. They're great, but not the best of the best. Next up is Sentinel Bonnie, and just doesn't do the overall best of damage, so they're just gonna go in B tier, probably above Pirate Withered Foxy, because Pirate Withered Foxy doesn't do that much DPS. But yeah, like, he's a very bulky tower, doesn't have that much range, and their main use is just to be like a supporting mid tower. But there's way better mid-game towers at this point who end up having more potential in the later game, or cost less and is less of a burden to use, because this guy takes up a lot of space and whatnot. Moving on, next up is Phantom Chica, who is the best of the summonable secrets, but obviously summon characters are not that good unless they are a nightmare, because they are extremely hard to get. But I think they will go like right here in C tier. One of the better C tier characters. The main issue is that they cost a little too much to place down. That seems to be a common thing with the summonable secrets, is that there is towers with similar performance or better performance, but they cost less usually. Next up is Phantom Balloon Boy, who is just like the top of B tier. But yeah, like as the thing says, he's just a usable character, but not a very good one. The problems with him is that his DPS is not very good. He does 1000 DPS, which is like 800 in these two characters. His pros though would be that he's not that expensive to place down, but he's still not a very great character to use. Another thing is that he probably does end up having like the second best splash mechanic, because his explosion radius is so large that it's almost like an AoE ability, but AoE abilities tend to have more value and are more practical to use. So if he just had like better DPS and probably a better range, he would probably be like up here with these four. But as of now, like, not very good. He was basically like a slightly better 7C's Foxy before he got buffed. Anyways, moving on, we have the Phantom Cupcake, who will be like right here in B tier. Of course, there is better DPS towers, and solo target DPS towers are just not the best unless they do very good damage, which we will see later on. But yeah, and similarly, Phantom Foxy is right below them. They are extremely similar in power. The difference is Phantom Cupcake has more range. I believe that is the only difference between them. It does say that Phantom Cupcake has the price tag of 1000 and Phantom Foxy has 800, but they both cost 800 to place. So they are extremely similar, and they both do a good amount more DPS than Pirate Wither Foxy. Moving on, we have Vendor Toy Chica, who will go in C tier and is barely better than Baker Toy Chica. Their DPS is slightly higher, and that is basically the main reason. For an extra $200, you just do a decent amount more damage per second. And yeah, not much else to say. Moving on, we have War Machine Foxy, who is of course still very good, but will go directly under Withered Golden Freddy, because Withered Golden Freddy just ends up doing more damage per second later on in the game when they are maxed out, and of course cover more area because you can place 4 of them down. But Withered Golden Freddy ends up costing more, and War Machine Foxy does more DPS on initial placement. But I think Withered Golden Freddy ends up being slightly better, but I don't mind swapping them around. Next up is Algae Freddy, who will go in the bottom of B tier, and Algae Freddy costs 1000 more than Endo 02, but does 1000 more total DPS, which is what I was talking about with Endo 02, where I think they just end up being in C tier because the bottom of B tiers end up just being better versions of them, basically. If Endo 03 was a lot cheaper, then they actually have a case of being B tier and potentially A tier, depending on how good the buffs are. But they are just an epic, so it doesn't really matter. Next up is Patriot Freddy, and also Witch Chica, and as you guys see here, we have a top 3, and one of them will be a starter, and you guys might be wondering who it is. And the big reveal is that it is not Patriot Freddy. So as time went on and I was using both of these towers and more information was revealed about them and whatnot, I'm afraid that Witch Chica is now the best starter in the game, and I am perfectly fine with that. So I gotta do some explaining with this one. So even though neither of them have gotten buffs or nerfs since the last tier list, It's more so people realizing how good Witch Chica was. And I also should have noticed it back then. But like back then, like Witch Chica was so cheap to trade for. Like they were worth like 200 souls for a normal Witch Chica. But now they've gone up to like 400 souls. And I believe they are still an obtainable tower to get. So they're actually only gonna end up costing more than Patreon maybe when the offer ends up going away. But also I believe Witch Chica probably has more exist counts and Patreon Freddy is like a one-time thing. So Witch Chica will probably always end up costing less souls than Patreon. But her overall performance just ends up being better than Patreon. So the pros and cons, the only really notable con for Witch Chica is that she costs more, and the big thing with Patreon is that he is very cheap, and of course they both have AoE abilities, but Witch Chica does overall more DPS. And a very underrated factor that I have also noticed myself is that Witch Chica seems to like either have a bug or an intentional feature that no one really knows about, where she just gains more money than towers usually do because of her poison effect, it seems like. And that ability is extremely strong and is literally like the crucial thing, a very busted thing for a starter to have. Like if your starter not only of course does good against the start of the game where they do good damage per second, and of course have an AoE ability, so that makes them even better as a starter because they can clear out the hordes of enemies that might spawn at the start of the game. But also for them to literally be able to make more money for you at the start of the game, it's extremely broken, because then like your starter levels, like the portion of the game that is considered the start of the game ends up being a lot shorter for you. Like you go into mid-game way sooner because of gaining money. So that ability is of course really strong. Like your starter lets you place down your broken high DPS characters sooner, and that just makes Witch Chica the best. Of course, the ability to also do AoE and of course not costing that much to place down factors a lot. But yeah, like more DPS, the broken ability to generate more money as a starter. The only thing Patreon has above her is costing less, which is just not enough for him to end up being better than her. So yeah, those are the placements for those two characters, and we will go ahead and move on with the rest of the placements. So next up we have Shadow Bonnie, and it's a little hard to rank like starters to like these high DPS characters. I think compared to Leviathan just ends up being better, especially since there is a better counterpart to Patreon. The thing is, like, no matter what, Patreon will have a very good use in costing only 300 to place down, and would only really go down in tiers a lot is if there is a new tower that also costs 300 to place, and of course it's just better than him, then yeah, his fall off would be really great. But since he is the best tower that costs 300 to place, then he will be staying a very good tower. Maybe his DPS ends up being really bad in FNAF 4, and you end up of course having more money to place down towers, like 10,000 or something, then people won't really be using him that much at that point. But in earlier story modes, like, he's just very useful for grinding them, because grinding in story mode is always viable. But yeah, moving on, we have Shadow Freddy, and he will be going in C tier, probably just above Uncommon Freddy, or possibly below. It's hard to tell. Same thing, like basically here. It's kind of funny. Like it's exactly like a one-on-one thing where this tower technically has a lot more value in the later stage. Like they both have really good value in their respective stage of the game, so it's hard to rank them, and that's what the other tier lists are for, so we don't compare like such day and night characters. Like they are completely different and they do completely different roles. But yeah, it doesn't really matter. He's somewhere in this tier. Phantom Chica is just way better because they cost the same amount, and Phantom Chica does a lot more DPS and I believe more range. If not, it doesn't really matter. She's just better. Next up, we have Phantom Gold Freddy, who will go in bottom of A tier, right there. So they have like the same pros as Withered Golden Freddy. However, Withered Golden Freddy has notably more damage per second than Phantom Gold Freddy. So he will be going A tier below. Next up is Mangle, who is the worst of the summonable secrets and will end up in the top of D tier because in the end they're just not very good. They can do like a good amount of DPS compared to all these characters, but Phantom Chica just does a good amount more DPS, and Phantom Angle is just too expensive for what they are. Next up is Toy Chica. They can just go like above Phantom Balloon Boy. They almost do the same. Like Toy Chica only does a little bit less damage per second than Balloon Boy, and they cost less, so they're just gonna be a better version of Balloon Boy. Next up is Withered Freddy, who will go like right behind Endo 03. He could be above because he does actually do more DPS, but I feel like this is like one of the rare instances where the cost actually makes Endo 03 better than a character. Next up is Golden Freddy. Surprisingly, we only just got to him, but he's gonna go right there. These two are very similar in power because these two are just really bad. They just cost too much. They can be interchanged because he does do twice the amount of damage per second than Balloon Boy and cost less, but the AoE mechanic is obviously still good, so it doesn't really matter. They're both really bad. Next up is Endo 02, and he will go right behind Rad Freddy. So yeah, at this point, I like Rad Freddy a lot more. And the reasons are, Rad Freddy literally only does 50 less damage per second compared to Endo 02. And I believe would probably cost less overall because of the placements amount. Like, because Rad Freddy only has 3 placements compared to 4 placements with Endo 02. And you might be saying like, well, he does do overall more DPS, doesn't he? Rad Freddy, even if it's only 50 damage, right? Rad Freddy has literally 10 more range overall than Endo 03. And you might say like, you can cover more of the map with 4 placements, and Rad Freddy's just gonna cover more map in general because of the range. The range is such a big factor, and in my opinion is what makes Freddy slightly better than Endo 02. But it doesn't really matter. Endo 02 can go above him, but in my opinion, I think Rad Freddy is just slightly better. Next up is the Mythic Bonnie. Another surprising that we only just got to him, but he will be going in C tier, right below Phantom Chica. He does one of the best DPS compared to like everyone here. I believe more than Endo 03, but he costs almost 4 times as much, so he's gonna be a little worse. And the explosion mechanic on Phantom Chica is still very good, so I think she is slightly above him. But yeah, it doesn't really matter. Could also be interchanged, but All I know is that Withered Freddy is for sure a better version of Bonnie, just because he's cheaper and does more damage. His only con compared to Bonnie is he has less range, I believe, but not by that much, so it's whatever. Next up is Phantom Freddy, who I think is just like barely better than Withered Bonnie. They do a good amount less damage compared to Withered Bonnie, but he costs way less than Withered Bonnie. I think Plain Boy either does a little bit less damage or just more damage than Phantom Freddy. Either way, Plain Boy should cost less to max out, so he's gonna end up being slightly better than the both of them. Yeah, moving on, we have Foxy, who I think is gonna go, at least for now, at the top of A tier. So compared to Phantom Mangle, I think Abyssal Foxy does end up costing more to max out than Phantom Mangle, just because of the extra level Abyssal has. But the pros and cons compared to these two, I think Abyssal has a little more range maxed out, and Abyssal has a slow ability, which I think is extremely strong, but Abyssal does do overall less damage per second, like 1,100 less damage per second. Also, on initial placement, Abyssal does do more damage per second than Phantom Mangle. So there's like pretty big pros and cons when comparing these two. So the pros and cons to these two characters are pretty different from each other, but I think Abyssal ends up just being a little better. Yet again, I don't really mind switching these two around. But yeah, moving on. This is a surprising one. I looked at the DPS chart, and honestly, some of you guys might not even believe me with this, so I will be bringing up the DPS chart for this one. But you can see here, this is crazy. Look how low Commando Endo is in DPS compared to everyone. He's literally below like Patriot Freddy, Uncommon Freddy, Foxy, Toy Bonnie, all of these like towers that are so low here, and is barely doing more damage than towers like these. Like, yeah, so he's gonna go in tier. Now, I did just show that like towers like Toy Bonnie does do more DPS than him, but like, so the thing about him is that he is also gimmicky, where he can summon towers, or not towers, but track towers or whatever, where it's like troops that walk on the track and deal damage and whatnot, but it's really like hard to calc how much DPS, especially when like the actual summoning of those track towers are like inconsistent, or like we don't know how frequent they spawn, and especially when they glitch out and they start going off of the track and they just go wherever they want to and ends up making them useless. So if that glitch is still happening, where those track towers that he spawns in, the endos basically, they're just endos that he spawns, where they just like keep going off the track, then that ability is practically a non-factor. It's just very inconsistent. So the only real things he has going for him is that he's not that expensive to place down, so even if he is like worse in DPS than some towers here, he at least does cost less, and he has the chance of actually doing more DPS just a little bit with the endos that he spawns in. But yeah, overall, for what we know, even though he was buffed twice, he is actually like extremely bad. Like, sure, I guess you could put him in like C tier, but I wouldn't like even want to suggest beginners to use him, because then they would like buy him with Robux, and then that's probably one of the worst ways you can spend Robux in this game, because you're just getting a tower who is not very good at all. So yeah, that's a sad one to place down. Like, I don't really care if you want to put him higher, but like he is not like B tier or above, honestly. He's just that bad. Oh, and also he does cost 600 to place down, but yeah, still not good. Moving on, we have the Cupcake tank, who is just also somehow a worse version of this guy. So he's obviously gonna go in bottom 3. I don't care about the placements. I just know that Endless Puppet is probably just guaranteed bottom 1, because you're just spending so much money for like someone who is gonna do worse DPS than Uncommon Freddy. Like, yeah, wow, such good financial choices. But this Cupcake tank is basically the same thing. You're spending a bunch of money for something that is practically useless. I guess you could probably put them above the Amalgam, because you actually are going to be doing some damage. But at least what the Amalgam does is consistent. They're actually slowing down the characters. But Cupcake tank, like, the spawn rate is slow and whatnot. I don't know if they like fixed it recently, but from what I know, like, I don't think so. And the tower itself doesn't actually attack, which is just bad. Just only summoning those track towers is not gonna make you good at all. They're just too gimmicky. They actually need to at least attack a little bit for me to like them. So yeah, nothing's really changed here. Obviously, this Chica can be bunched up with these characters, but I do want it to be bottom 3, and I don't think she is necessarily worse than them, but I can see her being worse. And then you can put like Amalgam up here. But yeah, for now, I will have her here. These are just the bottom 4 worst towers, bottom of the barrel, and are just not good to use. And also, the big thing that she has going for her is that for bottom 3, I say never use, but like, technically, people who literally just start off in the game usually have to use this Chica. So that's literally the main reason why she ends up being above these 3. And then like, anyone who's playing the game can avoid using them, these 3, no matter what. Like, they do not have to, but then with Chica, they might have to use her to when they're like starting off and whatnot. But yeah, moving on, we have Enforcer Bonnie, and they're gonna go like right here at, oh, not in B tier, in A tier. They're gonna go like at the top of A tier. Also, I just like noticed, I'm looking at the DPS chart. It says War Machine Foxy has 3 placements. If that is true, then he's just straight up better than Withergorn Freddy, and probably everyone here probably goes up here. This is the first I'm hearing about this. I don't actually use War Machine Foxy, but that extra 3rd placement makes them a lot more viable for like mid-game or as a starter and whatnot. You just spam them. I don't know if they necessarily would be S+ tier. I would have to really think about that. But they are straight up just they're straight up just like Golden Freddy, Withered Bonnie, but like really cheap. And probably better than just Phantom Mangle as well. I mean, he already is higher than Phantom Mangle. I am just gonna go ahead and put them above this Withered Golden Freddy, just in case it is 3 placements, and I don't mind him being above Withered Golden Freddy with only 2 placements. But yeah, I have to look into that a bit more. Like, with 3 placements, I think he can be like the top of S tier and whatnot, but we will see. For now, I'll just keep it like that. For the FNAF 4 tier list though, like for the next tier list I'll do though, I'll probably know for sure if he has 3 placements or not, and I'll put him in a more proper placement where I can for sure say he is. But yeah, for now he will be there. And Enforcer Bonnie, he's just like a better Phantom Mangle basically. And since these guys are so close, I think Enforcer just ends up being better than him. I can also see them being all 3 of them just being grouped up, like, oh, maybe like Enforcer is just not that good, but Enforcer is just way cheaper than Phantom Mangle while doing like 800 less DPS, so he can just stay there. He is in this upper echelons of towers though, but he's basically like an updated Plain Boy, because Plain Boy was basically just a good cheap DPS tower. The only thing is that I'm pretty sure Plain Boy still has more range, but what Enforcer does is still better. Next up is Rocketeer Mangle, who I think will go in A tier right below Phantom Mangle. So they're a really good, like, cheap explosion tower, but their main problem is the range is extremely bad. All I know is that they're likely better than Phantom Balloon Boy, so they could be here, but I'm gonna keep them here for now. I should actually try using them a bit more to see if they're viable, but they can go all the way down to here, but for now I'll keep them here. Next up is Valkyrie Chica, and honestly, yeah, I do think they are the best single target DPS tower. Might as well include this guy, who I believe is right behind her. But these two are extremely similar in power. So their pros and cons is this guy does a little bit less damage, only 300 less total DPS, which means each tower that you place down does 100 less DPS than her. Another con with him is that he has a little less range as well compared to Valkyrie Chica. But then his main pro against Valkyrie Chica is that he is cheaper. So like, it really just depends. Like, maybe sometimes I'll be like, yeah, he's better, and then other times I'm like, I guess Valkyrie can be better. I guess the best situation would be for someone who actually has both of them, and they can just alternate and for whatever suits the best of what they're doing. Like, for in-game long-term fights where you will have the money to afford it and the beginning of the fight is not that important, then Valkyrie Chica is better because she has a higher ceiling. But when the beginning of the battle is extremely important and you need to place down your strong DPS character as soon as possible, then this guy is better, because you can place him down way sooner than Valkyrie Chica. The 2,500 cost difference is huge, and of course the maxing out cost is also huge, but of course he ends up dealing a little less damage and having a little less range. But I'm fine with her being above him. They're just very interchangeable and not as different as people might think of them. Next up is Artillery Puppet, who I think will probably just be like right here. I don't fully know. I don't really use him, so he is like mid but usable. But I can see them being lower. I can probably see them being higher. But like, my main things is like, I can see them being more usable than all of these characters, except for like Shiny Hawaii and Bascade. But I do want to have the boosters, or I do want to have the support towers who do literally no damage at the bottom of the tiers. So then they're not completely included in the tiers. They're just there because the tier suits them. And yeah, this tier also suits the Artillery Puppet. They're just usably mid. Next up will be the Mercenary Foxy, who I think is almost great. And I guess the same would be for Phantom Balloon Boy, but they're just a little too underwhelming. The cost of like maxing them out is likely going to be more than maxing out War Machine Foxy. And now they're not even comparable if War Machine Foxy has 3 placements, because now War Machine Foxy will just be superior in general. Main issue that Mercenary Foxy would have is that on initial placement, his DPS is not that good. His DPS gets insanely stronger with the upgrades. It's basically the same thing with Enforcer Bonnie. They have like a bad start, but get insanely good. Yeah, I think they're just gonna stay in mid tier. Next up is Rad Freddy, who I think is right below Sniper Cupcake. That's basically because Sniper Cupcake and and Major Freddy have almost the same DPS, and as you can see, Cupcake costs less and also has way more range, so Cupcake ends up being better. Next up is Tarnished, and honestly, I think for now, they're better than Patriot. Tarnished seems very underrated for whatever reason. We can like look at their DPS as well, but they're literally at like 2000 DPS, which is up there with a lot of towers who cost way more than him. Like, he's just a starter, and the fact that they're doing like mid-game tower level of damage and whatnot makes them extremely good. And I just feel like in a good amount of situations, he can just be better than Patriot. Tarnish does like 10 times the damage as Patriot, probably 9 times, which means Patriot would have to hit like a swarm of 9 enemies, which is for sure possible, especially with like auto skip, where a bunch of enemies would end up grouping up because of the auto skip. But Tarnished only like doesn't even cost that much more, at least like on initial placement. With maxing him out, obviously he does end up costing a lot more, but I just think that Tarnished might be able to actually outperform Patriot Freddy in some situations, especially for FNAF 4. I feel like Tarnished will still be viable, and Patriot might just have a big falling off. We will see though. Anyways, next up we have our last 3 towers, and I'm just gonna rank Cupcake first as they're gonna be the lowest of the 3, and I'm gonna put them right behind Withered Freddy. They're not very good. Honestly, they can be lower, but they're just a beginner can use tier basically, because after like FNAF 1 and 2 and whatnot, they just don't do enough damage at all to be very viable. But they have the AoE mechanic and it's very strong. So yeah, these two, these are interesting ones that I saved for last, because you can see here that the last of the top 3 is an AoE tower, and they're both actually splash towers, but it's still like basically what I mean. Last tier list, I had Leviathan as the best AoE tower. The AoE slot is basically just for towers who do any sort of AoE mechanic. But yeah, you guys might be wondering which one of these two is the best, and you guys are crazy if you guys don't think he is not the best. Scott is obviously not better than him, and yeah, I will put Scott like right here. He could be better than him, but let's just get into this. I feel like this is very important and people might be wondering, but let's just look at this, guys. I need to include this in the video. Look at the total DPS that Glitch Puppeteer does, and tell me that he is not the best tower in the game. Like, you guys might see this and be like, oh, what if he just costs like a fortune to max him out and whatnot? He is not that expensive. He is only going to be like slightly more expensive than Valkyrie Chica or something. And you guys seem to really like someone like Valkyrie Chica as well. And you guys might be saying like, well, what about Scott though? Scott is like just as good as him. Some of you guys might think Scott is the best, but we'll go ahead and look at Scott's DPS and whatnot, and oh, he's only maxing out at 2000. So let's just compare these two real quick, the pros and cons. So the main pro with Scott is that he can be placed way sooner, but that does not mean that he costs overall less, because to max out one of these puppeteers, it actually costs less to max out a Scott, and it's only by like 5,000, but yet again, of course, it's still factorable. That doesn't completely make Scott worse though, because Scott can obviously be placed a lot sooner, which yes, I do value that. But Glitch Puppeteer just has a way higher ceiling than Scott. And it's not the biggest deal that Scott can be placed sooner. Even in the categories, like Scott is going to be lower than this Puppeteer because the Puppeteer, glitch Puppeteer that is just way better. So one maxed out glitch Puppeteer only does like 400 or 500 less DPS than a maxed out Scott. Around that amount or whatever. Or actually, you can just see here, yeah, one-on-one comparison. It's only 150 less damage per second. Now, in terms of range, Scott only has like either 5, yeah, Scott only has 5 more range. Like, I don't see how Scott would be better if on one glitch Puppeteer is only slightly worse and costs less to fully max out. Scott literally only has the plus side of being able to be placed sooner, which is a good ability, but is not good enough when this tower is doing insanely more DPS. Now, in terms of glitch Puppeteer versus anyone else in this game, like glitch Puppeteer has 40 range, which is 5 away from the max range which Scott has, and characters like Freddy also have 45 range. It's just the highest range that we have seen so far with towers. And in terms of the DPS, just like Scott has the best solo DPS, but there's only one of them you can place down. Besides Scott, glitch Puppeteer has the best solo DPS as well, and of course has the best overall DPS, and it is literally 700 more DPS than second place, and 1,000 more than Circuit Freddy, and of course over 1,000 and whatnot for the rest of the characters. Glitch Puppeteer is insanely better than everyone else, and of course does splash damage as well, which means he's at least doing twice the amount of damage than these two characters, because they can only target one character at a time. Meanwhile, this guy is doing more DPS than them, but can also deal damage to like up to like 5 enemies. I think that's how like big the splash would be, which means that he's basically multiplying his DPS by 5 or whatnot. Like, really depends on how many enemies he hits. But yeah, that's why AoE type characters are extremely good, because they're hitting multiple enemies at the same time. And that's why glitch Puppeteer is extremely broken. And we can go ahead and compare them to like Leviathan Mangle. What was like the main issue with Leviathan Mangle is that they're not the best DPS at the time, and they had extremely bad range, especially compared to like the best DPS. So then like people might be saying like, oh, Leviathan's not the best, especially when we have like other options. And at the time, I believe Abyssal Foxy was at its peak doing 3,600 while also slowing, so people probably thought Abyssal Foxy was the best at the time. And then also when Valkyrie Chica released, they probably thought she was the best because she also did one of the best DPS while also being cheap. But yeah, anyways, glitch Puppeteer does not have the cons of Leviathan Mangle. The only genuinely the only con that glitch Puppeteer has is that they don't have the best splash mechanic, which would be AoE, which is like, sure, whatever. And that they're not like a starter tower, but they're not even the most expensive tower either. They're actually like they're on the cheaper side. They're only like barely more expensive than like Leviathan and Valkyrie Chica, and these are like very fair pricing towers. So yeah, like I actually would make a tier above and just say absolute best ever, because yes, he gaps everyone. He's just insane. What's crazy too is that on initial release, unless if they just calculated it wrong, well no, I think it was just initial release, he actually did less DPS in both of these towers. He was at like 4,200 or something. I don't fully remember what the DPS was, But they actually buffed the glitch puppeteer. That is the most crazy buff ever that they ever did to a tower, because it was the most unneeded buff ever. I actually think that glitch puppeteer was gonna be the best tower in the game. Since they did that buff, it's just even more clear that they are the best. Like, you can just look at the numbers and there's no way that you would be confused that they're the best. And it's so weird when characters like Commando Endo actually need the buff, like for the third time, because they have already buffed Commando Endo, but it just hasn't been enough. I'm gonna go ahead and include the other two tier lists that I have, which are right here. So for AoEs, obviously Puppeteer is still at the top. Their damage is just too good to not be up there. And we have the starters, you guys can see that, and then DPS. And yeah, these two are very close, and you should actually just be here, probably up to here as well, honestly. I don't think he's gonna be better than these two though, but with the alleged 3 placement buffs, he's actually like up here just because he's one of the cheapest DPSs to use and whatnot. And then this is probably all fine. And then support, you're obviously the best as a shiny, and it kind of like tapers off, doesn't really matter. And these two are so bad that they have their own tier, they don't really fit anywhere else. But I have a second tier list that also categorizes everyone, and this is basically end game, mid game, and starters. This one was AoE starters and single target DPS towers. This one might be a bit more fair since it's just overall groupings. Either way, I feel like both of them are pretty informative. But yeah, this is for everyone who costs 10k and more. Oh wait, he should not be here. So this is for everyone who costs like 10k or more. I don't really know about PvP. He could be higher or lower, doesn't really matter. This guy can actually be like up here, honestly, if with the 3 placements. But yeah, for everyone that costs 10,000 or more, this is like the placements that I did, and 1,000 or more, or just over 1,000 actually, because the 1,000s end up being in starter area. This is how I feel about everyone, and then the supports, and of course these guys, no matter what, they're just not good. These guys, this guy is technically a support, but still the worst support. But yeah, if you guys really care about Endless Puppet, of course they're going to be at the bottom of the 10k plus tier. And this isn't a starter, so they're going to be like here. So yeah, they would be at the bottom of this. But yeah, that's my tier list video. I am willing to hear you guys' thoughts on it in the comments. I believe I am mostly right, but there could be some characters that I have overlooked and placed in a weird spot. Hope you guys agree with my justifications. Otherwise, yeah, doesn't really matter. It's just for fun, and just it should help for people who want a general idea of how good towers are. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.